Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
Our speaker, DIAN, she told me how long she's been sober, and she must have gotten sober when she was 12. I'm sure she'll tell about the early days. Again, she's from New Orleans. And y'all heard about the two guys walking out of a bar in South Louisiana, and walked out of the bar, and the bar had been closed a while, and rarely happens in New Orleans. But they come out of the bar, and big full moon like you see here in the South, and one of them looks up and he says to the other guy, said, "Is that the sun or is that the moon?" The other guy said, "Well, you know I'm not from around here." It's okay to boo. I'm used to it. DIAN, thanks for being here. Come on up. I appreciate it.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to take my shoes off. Hi, everybody. My name is DIAN, and I am an alcoholic. Hi, DIAN. And I want to thank everyone for the privilege and the honor to be here before you tonight. Although I also wanted to tell you that I really didn't want to be here. My dad passed away. On August 1st of this month, I celebrated 34 years of sobriety, and 2 days later, my dad passed away. But I'm happy to tell you, he passed away with 30 years of sobriety. And before he got sober, my mother had joined Al-Anon, and so she was ready. She was ready for that moment where she called the family together and said, "We're going to have a talk." And at that talk, which was December 8th, 1982, my dad begrudgingly went to treatment, where he was kicked out because they said he didn't really believe he was an alcoholic. In fact, they made him wear a sign and wear his pajamas and a sign that said, "I'm not really an alcoholic." And when they kicked him out, they said, "If you go to 90 meetings in 90 days, we'll graduate you. But we don't think you can do it." Of course, that's the one thing, the way you get an alcoholic to do it is you dare him. And he went to 120 meetings in 90 days. And when my mom died of ovarian cancer 13 years later, one of the last things she told him was that the 13 years of their marriage when he was sober were the happiest years of her life. And my dad went forward for 18 more years. My mom had told him on her deathbed, "Now, Norman, if you don't go forward with your life, you're going to get it from me in heaven." And the first thing, I was in San Antonio when my dad unexpectedly died, and the first thing I said to my husband when I heard from my stepmother that he had died, I said, "Ellen doesn't have to yell." He went forward with his life, and I saw more growth in him since my mother's death. And I just had to do that little tribute to him. I thank you for indulging me in that. I'm born in New Orleans. Had very close family, 3 brothers, very close extended family. We got together. There's a lot of beer flowing, a lot of tailgate parties, typical New Orleans family. So in typical New Orleans style, I was given my first drink by my parents when I was around 16. I had a fairly unexceptional childhood, except that I had loving parents, I knew that they loved each of us unconditionally. But somewhere in adolescence or puberty, my perception of myself in relation to others began to change. Now, most girls, the first thing to develop is boobs. For me, it was hips. And I just remember thinking, and height. I was 5'8" at the age of 11, and the boys who were like a whole foot younger than me nicknamed me the Jolly Green Giant. So I felt different, and in a sense, I was sort of different. But I didn't see that difference as good. I saw it as that I didn't belong. And I carried that sense of not belonging, of being really not good enough. That was sort of the theme of my life until I came into AA. No matter what happened, it wasn't good enough. I was salutatorian in a class of 600 in high school. That wasn't good enough because I wasn't first. On and on and on. Clancy says that alcoholics are people who need to be somebody because they don't believe they are yet. And that was me. I had to be somebody. And so I wish I could tell you I went to law school because I wanted to bring social justice to the world. I went to law school so I could be somebody. And if I had gotten sober first, I probably would have never gone because I would have realized I already was someone. I was me. I drank in college. It wasn't a problem. I didn't have a car. And although I lost my bike a couple of times on dates, my boyfriend didn't have a car either. I just didn't have any problems. College was not a challenge intellectually to me. But when I went to law school and I had a car, and my boyfriend was now 200 miles away in Mississippi, and I was in Baton Rouge, I realized first and foremost that I had to work really hard in law school or I couldn't become someone. And so I allowed myself the first year to drink once a month. We would have a section party. And one of the things before I came in the program was I wanted to dance. And I was so inhibited that by the time I was drunk enough to dance, I couldn't stand up. So I'd go to these section parties, get all bruised from falling on the dance floor. But it happened once a month, and it did not interfere with my studies or my performance, and it didn't seem to be a problem. I did so well my first year that I was asked to become a member of the law review, and I decided that I didn't have to be so stringent about studying. So I allowed myself to drink more in the fashion that I like to drink. Didn't affect my grades. My grades continued to get better. But what happened when I drank in law school the way that I liked to drink, unaccompanied by my boyfriend to keep me from harming myself or from doing things I would regret in the morning, is I began to go to bars by myself. I began to drink and drive. I began to very quickly violate most of the morals that I had been taught as a child. And this bothered me tremendously because I also realized that being in a professional school, that having a reputation for integrity was very important. And I had not acted with integrity in the way that I lived my life drinking. There was a movie that came out right before I got sober, Looking for Mr. Goodbar. I've never felt like a movie was shadowing my life more than with that movie. By day, she was a very quiet teacher, and at night, she was a train wreck. And that was me. And I made a decision in March of 1979. It was the best decision I ever made, that I simply would not drink at all. I had tried to drink less often, and I still got drunk when I drank. I had tried to drink less. That was totally not successful. And so in March of 1979, I said, I just won't drink. That's it. I cannot drink. And I could not drink. I could not make it 30 days. And so from some point in April until my sobriety date, I pretty much had to drink. I went to an exam in a blackout, was drunk for 5 days in Mexico, and at that point, I experienced on a daily basis the powerlessness of this disease because I had no power over alcohol. I did not want to drink. And a couple of things happened that got me into AA. You know, it's really funny. I've talked to a lot of people who are like this. We get drunk, we do insanely, zany things, and we think that our drinking is a secret. So I'm in the study room on the 4th floor of the law school, and a young man who was my friend, we just happened to study in the same room, and we would go out together sometimes to both pick up men. And he just picked his head up one day from studying, and he looked at me like you would say, pass the butter. And he said, people say you're an alcoholic. And I wish I could tell you that I was unimpressed and unaffected by it, but it was like a knife coming through me. It's, for whatever reason, I thought it was a secret. I thought that no one had noticed. So that was the first step. But the crowning blow was when my one very good friend in the world, who sat next to me in class, told me that I needed to go home because I was reeking of alcohol that was coming out of my pores. And she said, you go home and we'll talk later today. And she confronted me that night. She said, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I was granted, through God's grace, the ability to say to her honestly, dead. Because I knew that I was on the top of a mountain, I was doing really well in law school, but inside I was dying. I lacked integrity. I was filled with hatred and remorse and guilt. And I knew that whatever the foundation of how high on the mountain I stood, it was crumbling. And I knew that the downhill fall was going to take amazingly short amount of time for me to get all the way down. I knew that. I felt it in the marrow of my bones. And yet I didn't know what to do. I had tried not to drink. I had not heard of Alcoholics Anonymous. And she told me of a friend who had a brother who went to AA, and she knew him before and after, and she said, why don't you try it? So I called the central office in Baton Rouge on the Tuesday, and whoever sent that angel to answer the phone, she told me, wait until Thursday, there's a youth meeting. And had I gone to another meeting with a lot of older people who had been living on the streets, I'm afraid I would have heard the differences and said, see you in a couple of decades if I'm still here. But I went into a church on Thursday, August the 2nd, 1979, on Goodwood Boulevard in Baton Rouge for a group called the Agape Group. And I walked in, and there were about 25 beautiful-looking people in their teens, 20s, and 30s, and I'm thinking, oh God, it's the church youth group. And now I've got to ask them where AA is. And when they told me that they were AA, I was immediately hooked. Because I didn't think, I knew I was an alcoholic. I had a journal, and I wrote, I'm an alcoholic. But I just didn't think, I had this sense of terminal uniqueness. I didn't think that there was anyone in the world who thought the things that I thought, who hated themselves as much as I hated myself, who was never happy, but living in a state of free-floating, constant anxiety, and this feeling of impending doom. And at that first meeting, this room full of people close to my age, some younger, some older, they shared their thoughts and their emotions, and I believed at that point, until I heard them, that no one had these thoughts. No one had these emotions. No one did what I did. And that sense of belonging, that hearing the similarities, and as I said, what angel answered that phone to send me to that meeting. I wish I had tracked her down, because I wouldn't be standing here today if I had not gone to that meeting and had that sense of connection. So that's how my sobriety date came to be August 1st, 1979. I was so excited, my desire to drink was immediately lifted, and I had a whole new group of people to hang out with who didn't drink and who liked to have fun. And so for about a year and a half, partly in Baton Rouge and then in New Orleans after I got out of law school, I went to lots of meetings, went to every SONY's where people hung out after the meetings, went to lots of conventions, and I'm embarrassed to say I even told my story, which I'm not sure what my story was because I hadn't done a step. I must have said, I'm happy to be sober, thank you. And so for a period of over 2 years, that was my program. I did try to get a sponsor, but she told me I was immature, so I fired her. And then I couldn't find it, and I fired her, and I said, she's really not educated anyway. And I couldn't find another sponsor because they were old, they had children and grandchildren, and I wasn't married, and they were housewives, and I wasn't a housewife, and they weren't educated. So I sponsored myself, and which was really easy to do because I didn't see where I needed any of the steps. I was happy, joyous, and free. It took over 2 years for that magic carpet ride to crash. And when it crashed, the best thing I had going for me was that I had a home group. And that home group had a special meeting for home group members on Sunday mornings. We rotated houses, and we did a big book study. And those home group members who went to that big book study were the only group of people in whom I ever placed my trust to share at that kind of a level. Because I'd go to meetings and I would say, I'm happy to be sober, I'm so happy. And even when I wasn't, I would say, I'm so happy. But I told the members of this intimate big book study that I was more miserable than I had been when I came into the program. And I couldn't figure out what to do about it. And these old timers said, well, why don't you do this? To which I responded in the lawyerly fashion, but I have no desire to drink. This is not about drinking. This is about my emotions. And they said, well, then you know what's best for you. Keep coming back. And after about 3 months of whining to my home group members, it occurred to me that I had nothing to lose. And so without an iota of faith that doing the steps could solve my problems, I did the steps with a sponsor. And my program made that transition from what I called the relief from alcohol into the recovery from alcoholism. And so at around 3.5 years, my life and my program began to take off, and I experienced all of the promises. I had been practicing law, and I had gotten married to someone in the program, and I had a miscarriage. The doctor said I may never have a baby successfully without fertility treatments, which were impossible for me given where I worked and where his office was and where my car was parked and how long my lunch break was. And I went to hear my mother speak at one of the quarterly meetings at her home group, and I ran into someone who was the associate dean of a law school, who was then 3 days sober, whom I had met the year before when his wife went into treatment, and who asked me questions about my professors, because we went to the same law school. And in the interim between the first time I met him and when I met him when he was 3 days sober, he had gone around and asked people about me. Like, what do you think about her? She worked for you, how did she do? And when I ran into him with one of my good friends at this meeting, I was whining that I wanted to quit my job because I couldn't have children. And I didn't want to spend my life turning a buck for a corporation if I couldn't have what I really wanted. And so this man, 3 days sober, said, you should apply for a job that just was approved. You have the credentials. I'm like, how do you know that? It wasn't on my to-do list. It was not on my to-do list. And I went forward with that career, which I'm still in that career, not because it was what I wanted to do with my life, but at a moment in time it seemed like the next right thing to do, because it would give me more autonomy with my time if I wanted to pursue the fertility treatments. And if I couldn't have children, it would give me more flexibility to do maybe an adoption. And I'm here to report to you that 3 days after I finished grading my first set of finals, and every other year thereafter, until after having 4 children, my husband canceled the subscription. I came to find out that this career of being a law professor was a better job than what I had on my to-do list. And I came to understand that miscarriage, I didn't tell you about the miscarriage, excuse me, I had a miscarriage. And it was the miscarriage that made the doctor tell me that I might not ever successfully carry, and got me really depressed. And so, had I not had that miscarriage, which at the time I questioned, I call it living in the mystery of God's will. Why did this happen to me? Why did this happen? And I've come to learn that that's not even a relevant question. Why is generally not a relevant way to start, is relevant question. But at that time, I just felt so devastated by having lost this child and being told I may never have one. But had that not happened, I would have never gone into teaching. And that the career that came as a result of the miscarriage was a better career than I had planned. And I learned at that point from that experience that my dreams were really limitations, and that what God had in store for me was better than I would have given myself. And so I went into teaching, and I popped out a kid every other year, and I decided to put my husband through school and through law school, and we began a period, and he was in the program too, we began this period of abundance and of a loss of perspective. We had so much in the way of successes that the program didn't seem that important anymore. And this is for each of us. And we both withdrew from a lot of our participation in H&I or TNC and in sponsoring people. And as a result, he drank, and I just went crazy. And it was in my 18th year of physical sobriety that I hit what I hope to be my emotional bottom. I used to call it my Al-Anon bottom, but that's not really true. It was my emotional bottom. Because what happened when my life became abundant and I began to pull away from the program. And I fired my sponsor and fired my sponsees as I lost that accountability. And when I become self-reliant, the distortions in my perception begin to crop back in. I mean, I still have distorted perceptions, but I have no accountability. I have no one to tell me that, you know, you're just crazy, it's not that way. Or as my sponsor, after my divorce, I dated this guy for 2 months, and he broke up with me, and I was boo-hooing to her because no one had ever broken up with me. And I'm boo-hooing, and she just laughed. She says, it's about time. Everybody should have that experience. So that's the kind of accountability that I need, because she said, you aren't in love with him. I said, well, no, but no one's ever broken up with me. She says, well, it's about time. So without that accountability, here's what happened. From the time I was a little girl, was always wanting to be a good girl. I wanted to be loving like I saw my mother. I wanted to have a good work ethic like both of my parents, and I always wanted to be a good wife and a good mother. But as I lost my connection to the program, and I lost my accountability, and as my relationship with the God of my understanding became an intellectual relationship, rather than in the heart, I began to lose sight of how manipulative my behaviors were. And I'll give you an example. My first husband liked to play golf, and as I said, I put him through law school. I worked while he went to get a degree, and a college degree and a law degree. And so I had 2 of the children when he was in law school, so I had maybe a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, and an 8-year-old, all boys. And he'd say, someone invited me to go to Maui for 8 days to play golf. What do you think? And I'd say, oh, you should go. You should go. And I'd be there all weekend filled with resentment. And eventually, I mean, as I said, he drank, but I got rid of him because he was self-centered. And it took me hitting that emotional bottom and my willingness to steps again, because again, at 18 years, after having done them quite a few times, I was once again at the place where I couldn't imagine how they could work. I saw that that my primary character defect was self-pity. I had a martyr mentality. It was the template, the victim template through which all perceptions were created. And it's hard to be a victim if people don't do things to you. So letting your husband go play golf and then being resentful is a good way to become a victim. And so at that point, I hit my real emotional bottom. And what happened, the way I describe it is, I came in, and what I wanted when I first came into the program was I wanted to be a woman of integrity, because my actions were not things that a woman with integrity would do. I had no self-respect. And I could see when I was drinking and when I first came in that there was a major gap between what actions I took and what a woman with integrity would do. And then as my life became abundant and I was working the program, I wasn't trying to measure where I was in relationship to the woman I wanted to be, because I was just doing the next right thing. And when I'm really living a God-based program, I'm not measuring. I'm just doing the next right thing. But as I pulled away from the program, I began to focus again on self-reliance and on this being the perfect wife and the perfect mother. And I so deluded myself that I came to believe during that period that there was absolutely no gap between the woman I was and the perfect woman. I mean, I really thought, when I was a spiritual giant, I was at my lowest point in life. because I was so deluded. And my poor first husband, who I tossed away because he was selfish, I mean, he did what alcoholics do when they don't have another solution. And what I did was just plain crazy. As I said, that was my emotional bottom, and I hope it remains my bottom. So as I forged forward after that, I became extremely involved in sponsoring people and in service work, and I regained or entered into a new period of my sobriety, which would be more in my 20s. And it was during this period when I was beginning to do the steps on the wreckage of my marriage that I came to understand a statement that it's in the 12 by 12 in the fourth step. And I want to quote it because I want to say it right. It's on page 53. It's into the fourth step. The primary fact that we fail to recognize is our total inability to form a true partnership with another human being. And I looked back at that marriage. It was not a partnership. It was not a partnership at all. I was accumulating points for my martyrdom. That's not a partnership. And it wasn't until after I had done the steps that I began to work with my current sponsor that I began to share what really I felt and really I thought, rather than just saying, I'm fine, I'm fine. And I came to learn that the period of my emotional bottom, without being self-reliant, without accountability, without God-centeredness, my emotions, what does it say in the big book? Childish emotions. You know, they did that study when AA was early, and they found alcoholics have 3 characteristics in common. They're childish, they're emotionally sensitive, and they're grandiose. And so my emotional nature, my childish emotions, when I lost my God-centeredness, those were the master pulling the leash. And whatever rationality I had, it was the puppy being pulled around. My emotions were calling the shots. And as I progressed in working with my sponsor and in getting more involved in the program during my 20s, I'm happy to say that on most days, it's the emotions that are at the being pulled. They're the puppy dog. Now, I say that because when I go to meetings and I hear people say, oh, I've been sober 10 years and I still, fill in the blank. I like to laugh really loud because I'm still fill in the blank. It's that it no longer dominates me. There is still a 5-year-old girl who lives in me. She doesn't visit me as often as she used to, and she hasn't been pulling the leash for a number of years. But she tells me what she thinks a 5-year-old would do. And my relationship with her, and I refuse to call her me. I know it's just a part of me. I was telling my story about 4 years ago in New Orleans, and I shared something that I had never shared before about my relationship with my current husband. And in the middle of the share, the little girl said, "Don't you tell them that. Don't you tell them that." And I'm happy to say I ignored her because it was something that I needed to own. But this little girl, she's still within me, and she still tells me how she feels. And I have, at this point, developed 2 different responses to her. Number 1, take a nap. Number 2, you're not old enough to make these decisions. And I have to tell you that between the time of my dad's death and the date on which we buried him, that little girl talked to me a lot. There was a difference of opinion between my dad's widow and my brothers and me about how quickly we should bury my dad relative to how quickly his stuff needed to get out of the house. And the little girl in me was like, his body's lying on the table and the clothes are coming out of the house and this is just not right. And I told that little girl, you're not old enough to do this. Dad would want us to honor the wishes of his widow. And so that little girl she never made a public appearance. She lives in my head, but I don't let her come out and play very often without supervision. She needs lots of naps. And I say that because if you'd asked me at 4 or 5 years when I was really having that first period of growth, what I thought things would be like at 34 years, I would have said, God will have found that none of my defects were useful and he would have removed them all, yada, yada, yada. And the truth is that I haven't, in the inventories I've taken, both the 10th step and the 4th step, I haven't caught any new defects. I also haven't really, God has not found it fit or useful to totally remove any defect. But the defects they are no longer running the show. And I know it says in the big book around page maybe 80, 87, it talks about pausing when agitated. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, those 3 words encompass a process that can take a very long time. And in the first few years of my divorce from my first husband, it was impossible for us to talk without playing the game of what I call one-upsmanship. He'll say something that hurts my feelings, I come back with something else, and then he comes back, and nobody wins, and everybody feels hurt and unrespected. And so when I talked to my sponsor about this, we talked about pausing when agitated and some of the things I could do. And I have to tell you that it took me a while to recognize agitation, because when you think you're right and you're upset because someone doesn't agree with you, that's not agitation. They're just wrong. And you need to show them that they're wrong. And just to do an aside, I've been for 12 years with my current husband, and we were together about 3 years, and I don't know what we were talking about, but he looked at me and he said, "You like to be right." And I looked at him in all sincerity. I said, "You are so wrong." I lost my train of thought. So anyway, somewhere with my character, I totally lost my train of thought with that one. But the character defects, they're definitely still there. They don't necessarily scream at me, and I became eventually able to realize that I was agitated, that that it's not a question of being right, it's a question of reaching an agreement. And the next part of so recognizing that I'm agitated is part of the process. Then the next part of the process is to develop a willingness to pause. Because I could recognize I was agitated and I was still trying to think of the next verbal punch. So to develop the willingness to pause was a process. And then to finally to pause and to disengage. And what I learned is the same thing that I learned when I came to grips with how self-pity was in the victimness that prism through which my perceptions were based, that being freed of that, being freed of having to be right, being freed of seeing myself as a victim, being freed of having to have the last word, how empowering is that? How empowering is it to see myself not as a victim, not as the pinball in the machine to be thrown around by everyone's slings and arrows? How empowering is that? And to be able to say, when someone is trying, particularly my first husband, when we would talk about money after we were divorced, to say, when he would be trying to get me to say something, like to commit at that moment, to say, I will get back to you later. Because what I learned in the process of trying to pause when agitated was that there's not enough space in my rational being for emotions and rational thought to coexist. So if something triggers my strong emotions, I cannot engage in a meaningful and productive discussion. I have to manage my emotions. In fact, whatever my emotions are, they're my problem. They're my problem. Emotions are absolutely wonderful. They are the unique reaction that this being has to what is experienced and what I believe is going on, whether I'm right or not. But regardless of the source of the emotion is my responsibility to deal with. And I have to deal with that emotion before I can have a conversation. Because if I don't do that, I'm looking at a lot of ninth steps. Because if my emotions are, if that 5-year-old girl's at the bargaining table, it's not going to go well. That 5-year-old girl is not old enough to make those decisions. And the last thing I guess I want to talk about is sort of where I see myself now. Starting around 2005, the second son that I have began to have a lot of problems in school with drugs and alcohol. And then the following year, his older brother began to show some signs that maybe he was one of us too. And I had gone to Al-Anon during my divorce, which really helped me to deal with letting go and a lot of issues with my first husband. But then I stopped going after pretty much about a year after the divorce because I felt cured. We weren't married anymore. And so when my children started to have problems, I wish I could tell you that I ran to Al-Anon, and I wish I could tell you that I engaged in tough love. And I can't tell you that. I can tell you that I'm the kind of mother who could love her kids to death. That I stood in the way of their consequences, that I stood in the way of them being able to grow up, that my maternal instinct to protect my children from themselves was no longer an asset, but my greatest liability. And in my last venture over the last 2 years has been to get myself grounded in Al-Anon so I can get out of the way. I told you in the beginning that my dad had 30 years of sobriety. I never 12-stepped my dad. In fact, when I told my mother that I had gone into AA, I made her promise me that she wouldn't even tell my dad because I knew he'd be ashamed of me, and I knew he'd be very angry with me. So I made her promise that she wouldn't tell me. And that she wouldn't tell my dad. And so after I told her and I went back up to LSU, she did 2 things. First, she started going to Al-Anon. And second, she told my dad. And he was really very angry with me. It was the first time that our relationship was extremely strained. And I never talked to him about AA. In fact, I wasn't necessarily convinced that he was an alcoholic, because his worst drinking took place after I had gone off to college, when my youngest brother, and perhaps even my second youngest brother, who's here with me tonight, over there, Kenny, when they were still at home. I hadn't been there for that. I helped participate in the intervention because my mother asked me to, but the intervention wasn't about his alcoholism. It was about what we told him was how his drinking affected us, how we were harmed. And after my dad came in the program and all three of my brothers wound up in the program, I never 12-step any of my brothers. I never told them about AA. When their pain of where they were was greater than their fear of change, they took action, just as I did. But when it came to my children, I was there to try and force them into AA, to try and manipulate them into recovery. And all I did was, I think, slow down the process by which they would actually come to AA. And I've made amends to those children, and I continue to go to Al-Anon so that I don't want to be the mother who loves her children to death. It's been, in some respects, a harder challenge because I must have very strong maternal instincts. I resent it when people call me a helicopter mom, but I definitely love my children, but I don't love them enough to love them. The loving them to death is not the kind of love that I want to give them. And so I have been, I gave myself 45 minutes, so I'm gonna end right now, but I just don't want to do that. And it's been hard. I've had some slips. I have, just as I cultivated my first husband's selfishness by agreeing to things, it was really very manipulative of me to agree to something that then became the basis of my martyrdom. But I've cultivated a lot of the dependence that has occurred in my children by letting them come back and interfering with the natural consequences. And so I've been in this program a long time. I'm not finished growing up. The 5-year-old girl is still there, but she doesn't get to make the decisions. Thank you very much.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. If that shows up, the gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.